Episode 16, Part 01, Chapter 16. Chapter 16. Eventually, the dust began to settle in the Sector 6 park, and a deadly silence fell upon the area. All the dirt that had covered the ground had been blown up and now was spread across the floor. Debris was scattered everywhere, and some had smashed their way through some of the park toys as they landed. The swings had been torn from their hinges end, and the slide had a large hole in it where one chunk of metal landed and had ripped through the slide as though it were just paper. The doors that led into Sector 7 had been burst apart as the plate landed on the sector, with the broken doors lying dented and shattered at the sides. Now, what was visible through the door was the broken plate along with other crushed pieces of metal. Parts of the metal were a deep red, orange color as fires burned deep within them, slowly beginning to burn through. The only sounds coming from the sector were slow, deep creaks coming from the plate as it settled into place in its new home. There were no sounds of life coming from the sector, and no movements of people beyond. It was impossible to see through the wreckage, not that there was anything left to see. The only survivors from the wreckage were lying scattered on the floor of the park, their bodies charred and aching from their rough landing after swinging through the sector. They had lost hold of the cable as the plate finally crashed, and had landed in the park along with the wreckage where they remained frozen, too afraid to move until everything had fallen silent once more. Slowly, one by one, the three opened their eyes and gradually began to climb to their feet, the dirt and small pieces of metal falling from their bodies. They ached heavily as they stood up, they had taken quite a beating in their fall. As they stood up they turned towards the door of Sector 7 and walked slowly towards it, their eyes seeing the overall devastation for the very first time. Barrett came to a stop in the middle of the park, his eyes opening wide as he saw what was left of Sector 7.
Marlene! Marlene!
He shouted. Tifa and Cloud watched sadly as Barrett ran up to the wreckage blocking the sector's entrance. Barrett stopped at the wreckage and began to look around frantically, desperately trying to find some way into the sector through the mounds of metal blocking his path.
Marlene!
He yelled, even though inside he knew that Marlene would not be able to answer him. Desperately, he ran down the side of the door, constantly searching for a way in.
Biggs!
He ran down the other side, trying to peer through the metal.
Wedge!
He ran back to the middle and shouted to the sky.
Jesse! Damn it! Goddamn it all to hell! What the hell's it all for?
In his mind's eye he could picture Marlene, sitting alone in the seventh heaven anxiously waiting for him to return. She would have had no idea what was going on, or know why people were running around and screaming. Only at the last minute when she looked out of the window would she realize what was happening, and she would call out for Barrett.
Argghhhh!
Barrett bellowed angrily, and he began to hit the metal in his anger. His pounds were pointless, but he continued to hit them in his desperation and his rage.
Hey, Barrett!
Cloud called out to him.
Barrett!
Said Tifa. Barrett didn't listen.
Argghhhh!
He roared.
Hey! Barrett, stop!
Tifa pleaded, her voice falling to almost a whisper.
Please stop, Barrett! Argghhhh!
Barrett raged one last time. He stopped hitting the wall of metal and stepped back, raising his gun arm and firing dozens and dozens of bullets into the metal. The bullets hit and rebounded away from the wall, causing no damage at all. After a moment or two Barrett stopped firing his gun and fell sadly onto his knees, the last of his rage burned out at long last. With the last of his energy he raised his fist and hit the door one last time, although it was a weak, pathetic punch.
God damn!
He whispered, his voice gone, and behind him Tifa and Cloud slowly looked away. A little while later, Barrett had finally moved away from the wreckage blocking the entrance and was sat on the ground near to the broken slide in silence. Tifa and Cloud were stood around him also in silence, unsure of what to say to comfort the heartbroken man. All of the rage had completely burned out of Barrett now, and now all he could so was sit by the slide and try to fight the overwhelming tears that were growing in his eyes over his loss of Marlene. Cloud and Tifa were also in shock over what had just happened. Tifa's mind was focused still on all of the people who had been in the slums at the time. Even though she had warned them and told them to leave, many of them had remained in the slums. There would have been no time for them to leave when the plate began to fall. Now they were all dead, buried forever in the wreckage of the sector. Cloud on the other hand, had his mind on something else.
Marlene?
Barrett whispered. Tifa thought silently for a moment, before she finally looked up at Barrett.
Barrett? Marlene is. I think Marlene is safe.
Barrett stopped and looked up at Tifa, his eyes hopeful.
Hey.
Tifa folded her arms, thinking back to the moments before the plate fell.
Right before they took Eris, she said, "Don't worry, she's all right." She was probably talking about Marlene. Really?
Tifa lowered her eyes.
But...
Barrett also looked at the ground.
Biggs. Wedge. Jesse. All three of them were in the pillar,
stated Cloud.
Think I don't know that?
Barrett demanded, jumping to his feet angrily. His fists shook as he spoke.
But... we, all of us fought together. I don't want to think of them as dead. And the other people in Sector 7,
said Tifa.
This is all screwed up.
Barrett shouted, shaking his fists.
They destroyed an entire village just to get to us. They killed so many people.
Tifa looked at him.
Are you saying it's our fault?
She asked him, her voice choking slightly.
Because Avalanche was here? Innocent people lost their lives because of us. No, Tifa. That ain't it.
Barrett said to her, the rage rising in him again.
Hell no. It ain't us. It's they dem Shinra. It's they dem Shinra. It's never been nobody but the Shinra.
Tifa folded her arms and looked down in thought as Barrett continued.
They're evil and destroying our planet just to build their power and line their own dem pockets with gold. If we don't get rid of them, they're gonna kill this planet. Our fight ain't never gonna be over until we get rid of them. I don't know. What don't you know?
Barrett asked of her.
You don't believe me.
Tifa shook her head.
It's not that,
she said.
I'm not sure about me. My feelings.
Barrett glared at Tifa for a moment, before he turned sharply to Cloud.
And what about you?
He asked. Cloud had turned away during Barrett's length speech about his hatred for the Shinra, and had even walked a few steps away as well. He seemed to have something else on his mind, and as Barrett spoke to him, he looked up towards the Sector 6 plate. Was all he said, before he walked away from them and headed off into the winding truck graveyards that led the way to Sector 5.
Yo!
Barrett called after him. Cloud didn't answer him and just walked away. Barrett turned to Tifa.
Where's he think he's going?
Tifa jumped as she remembered.
Oh. Eris. Oh yeah, that girl,
said Barrett thoughtfully.
What's up with her?
Tifa shook her head.
I don't really know,
she admitted.
But she's the one I left Marlene with. Damn. Marlene.
Barrett shouted. He ran towards the gate of the park to follow Cloud to Sector 5. He stopped suddenly beside the gate, and turned back to Tifa.
Tifa. There ain't no turning back now.
With that he ran off after Cloud. Tifa remained in the park for a few moments more as she looked back towards the wreckage that was Sector 7, where the glowing red fires were still burning fiercely deep inside. In that wreckage were 3 of her friends, along with the rest of Sector 7. But Barrett was right, it was because of Shinra that those people had died. So she took a breath to let go of her grief, and then walked away leaving Sector 7 behind her. Cloud meanwhile was slowly walking through the truck graveyard that joined Sectors 5 and 6 together. He was silent as he walked, for his mind was only thinking of Eris at that point. He blamed himself for her being captured by the Turks. She was another innocent who had been caught up in the tragedy, and it was because of him that she had been captured. He could have been more firm with her and insisted that she went home where she would be safe from them, but her cheerful and light-hearted personality had made him succumb to that. Eris was very insistent, and even though she knew the danger she was putting herself in, she still came along with him and Tifa, regardless. That still didn't make Cloud feel any less guilty, and he knew he had to go back to Eris's house to let her mother know.
Cloud.
Cloud stopped and turned as Barrett ran up towards him, followed closely by Tifa. The two stopped beside him, and Barrett stepped up close to him.
Take me to Marlene,
he said simply to Cloud.
Are you going to help Eris?
Asked Tifa. Cloud slowly nodded his head.
Yeah.
He replied.
But before that, there's something I want to know. What's that?
Asked Tifa. The young man in front of them turned away and looked up towards the plate above them. From where they were they could see the pillar of Sector 5, standing firm and secure and holding up the plate.
It's about the ancients, said Cloud.
As he looked up towards the plate, a fairly family cold wave began to run through his veins, making Cloud space out a little. His eyes flickered until they were shut, and a strange voice began to speak in his mind. In my veins courses the blood of the ancients. I am one of the rightful heirs to this planet. Cloud blinked and held his head in his hands. He shook it until the faint ringing in his head faded.
Sephiroth!
He whispered, and fell down onto his knees.
Are you all right?
Asked Tifa.
Pull it together, man.
Barrett said unsympathetically. Cloud pushed himself to his feet, giving his head a final shake before turning to Tifa and Barrett. Tifa was looking at him with a look of concern, while Barrett had his head tilted to the side as he looked at Cloud with a puzzled look on his face. Cloud didn't say anything and simply turned away, beginning to walk on through the dirty alleyways as though nothing had ever happened. Barrett and Tifa followed close behind, walking silence as they headed on to Sector 5. Even though it was nighttime, there were many people out and about in Sector 5. They had all been woken up by the sound of the Sector 7 plate crashing, and many children were crying in their beds while the adults were running around trying to find out what was going on. They ignored Cloud and his friends as they entered the sector, too busy with their own affairs to care. The only quiet place was at Ares' house, which was still just as quiet and as calm as it was when Cloud left it earlier that night. He was surprised to find that the door was ajar as he approached, and walked straight into the house with Barrett and Tifa behind him. Elmira was standing in the living room with her back to them as they entered. She neither flinched nor looked up as she heard the door open and close behind her, for she knew immediately who had just walked in.
Cloud. Wasn't it?
She asked. She slowly turned to Cloud and his friends, her face somber and red as though she had been crying.
It's about Ares, isn't it?
Seeing the sight of the woman's heartbroken face made Cloud feel even guiltier.
Sorry,
he apologized sincerely.
The Shinra have her.
The news didn't seem to come as a surprise to Elmira. Her eyes filled up again, and a single tear ran down her old face. She turned away from the group and walked away from them towards the kitchen.
I know,
she said finally.
They took her from here. They were here.
Cloud asked in surprise. Elmira turned back to him.
That's what Ares wanted. Why is the Shinra after Ares?
Cloud asked, a question that had been burning inside of him since he met Ares in the church. Once again Elmira turned away from them.
Ares is an ancient,
she answered.
The sole survivor. What did you say?
Asked Barrett in surprise.
But, aren't you her mother? Not her real mother,
Elmira replied. She lifted her apron and wiped a tear from her eye, swallowing hard for a few moments to gather herself. When she had finished she looked up.
Oh. It must have been 15 years ago. During the war. My husband was sent to the front. Some faraway place called Wutai. One day, I went to the station because I got a letter saying he was coming home on leave.
Elmira walked up to the Sector 5 train station, her heart beating excitedly at the thought of seeing her husband after so long. The train had just pulled in when she arrived, and already the passengers were beginning to pile off the train. A strong young man stepped off first, where her fiancé immediately ran to him from the platform. They embraced as they met, and he lifted her up in his arms and spun her around before they headed off home together. An elderly man, who had not returned from the war, was the next to step off. His wife ran to him also, but instead of him lifting her, she lifted him, and together they also walked off towards the sector. Elmira waited patiently as the rest of the passengers descended from the train. She began to feel a little desperate as more stepped off, but not one of them was her husband. Eventually the crowds began to thin, until eventually there was no one left on the platform except for her. The train door closed, and Elmira quickly ran to the station guard and asked if there was anyone else on board. Regretfully the guard shook his head, and Elmira sadly turned away. She walked down the stairs of the platform and stopped at the bottom, staring at the floor in sadness.
My husband never came back. I wonder if something happened to him? No, I'm sure his leave was just cancelled. I went to the station every day. Then, one day.
On the fifth day Elmira returned to the station once more, praying with all her heart that this would be the day that her husband returned home to her. She was surprised to find that there were very few people gathered around the station on that particular day. In fact, there were only 2 people on the platform that day, and as Elmira set her eyes on them, she immediately gasped and ran quickly towards them. It was a mother and a child. The mother, a beautiful woman with luxurious long brown hair, had collapsed on the stairs of the platform with sheer exhaustion. Her daughter looked to be only 7 years old, and looked so much like her mother it was uncanny. She had the same long, wavy brown hair and gentle brown eyes. She was kneeling beside her mother with tears in her eyes, begging her mother to get up. Elmira ran to the 2 and knelt down beside the girl's mother. The young girl ran around to Elmira and pleaded with her to make her mother better again. Elmira looked at the girl's desperate face, which was full of tears. Slowly, the girl's mother turned her head to look up at Elmira. She opened her mouth to speak and slowly whispered something in Elmira's ear. When she finished, she lay back and closed her eyes, and her body fell limp as she gave in to her exhaustion and died in front of Elmira and her daughter. The young girl immediately burst into tears and threw her arms around Elmira, who wrapped her up and held her tightly, letting the girl cry. Elmira closed her eyes as she remembered.
You used to see this sort of thing a lot during the war. Her last words were, "Please take Eris somewhere safe." My husband never came back. I had no child. I was probably lonely. So I decided to take her home with me. Eris and I became close very quickly. That child loved to talk. She used to talk to me about everything.
The elderly woman smiled as she remembered some of the happy times she had with Eris when she was a young child. One of her fondest memories, strange though it was Eris running down the stairs towards the living room and falling over. She had helped the young girl get up, and Eris immediately ran outside to the garden. Seeing that continued to remind Elmira of Eris's determinism and inability to give up.
She told me escaped from some kind of research laboratory somewhere. And that her mother had already returned to the planet, so she wasn't lonely. And many other things. Returned to the planet?
Barrett asked. Elmira shook her head.
I didn't know what she meant. I asked if she meant a star in the sky, but she said it was this planet. She was a mysterious child in many ways.
Eris walked calmly down the stairs towards Elmira as she stood waiting in the living room. As she looked up, Elmira could see that the young girl had a rather serious expression on her face, and a look of sadness.
Mom,
she said, her voice gentle.
Please don't cry. Eris just blurted that out all of a sudden. When I asked her if something happened.
Eris hung her head sadly.
Someone dear to you has just died, she said. His spirit was coming to see you, but he has already returned to the planet.
Elmira shook her head again at the memory.
At that time I didn't believe her. But several days later, we received a notice saying my husband died.
She closed her eyes as she remembered the grief she had felt when she read that notice from the Shinra.
And that's how it was. A lot had happened, but we were happy. Until one day.
Eris stood as close to Elmira as she could as they both looked at the man who had just entered the house. Theng of the Turks was standing in the doorway, looking at Elmira.
We want you to return Eris to us,
Theng was saying to her.
We've been searching for her for a very long time. No.
Eris shouted defiantly from behind Elmira, clutching onto her apron. She shook her head vigorously.
Never.
Theng looked at Eris.
Eris, you're a very special child,
he said to her, speaking in a soft, gentle voice so as to encourage her.
You are of special blood. Your real mother was an ancient. Of course I heard it. That she was an ancient. The ancients will lead us to a land of supreme happiness,
said Theng.
Eris will be able to bring happiness to all those in the slums. That is why Shinra would like Eris's cooperation. He's wrong.
Eris shouted again. She ran out from behind Elmira and continued to shake her head in defiance.
I'm not an ancient. I'm not. But Eris,
Theng said reasonably.
Surely you hear voices sometimes when you're all alone?
Again Eris shook her head.
No, I don't.
And with that Eris ran forward, brushing rudely past Theng and out into the garden to hide so she couldn't be found and taken away from her new home. Theng looked on almost sadly as the young girl ran off.
But I knew,
said Elmira, opening her eyes.
I knew about her mysterious powers. She tried so hard to hide it, so I acted as though I never noticed.
Cloud folded his arms.
It's amazing how she's avoided the Shinra for all these years. The Shinra needed her, so I guess they wouldn't harm her,
said Elmira.
But why now?
Muttered Tifa.
She brought a little girl here with her,
said Elmira.
On the way here, Theng found them. She probably couldn't get away fast enough. She decided to go to the Shinra in exchange for the little girl's safety. Must be Marlene,
Cloud assumed.
Marlene!
Shouted Barrett.
Eris was caught because of Marlene.
He ran past Cloud to Elmira.
I'm sorry. Marlene's my daughter. I'm really sorry.
Elmira's eyes flashed at him angrily.
You're her father,
she shouted, sounding disgusted.
How in the world could you ever leave a child alone like that?
Barrett held his head and shook it.
Please don't start with that,
he begged of her.
I think about it all the time. What would happen to Marlene, if...
He swallowed hard, trying to convey his true feelings.
But you gotta understand something. I don't got an answer. I wanna be with Marlene. But I gotta fight. 'Cause if I don't, the planet's gonna die. So I'm gonna keep fightin'. But, I'm worried about Marlene. I really just wanna be with her. Always. See? I'm going in circles, now.
Elmira looked at Barrett closely. Gradually the harsh look in her eyes softened as she believed that Barrett's words were sincere.
I think I understand what you're saying,
she said.
She's upstairs asleep. Why don't you go and see her?
Barrett smiled gladly and immediately ran upstairs towards Eris's bedroom where little Marlene was waiting for him. Once he was gone, Tifa sighed heavily.
It's my fault,
she whispered sadly.
I was the one who got Tifa involved in this. Don't say that,
said Elmira.
Eris doesn't think that.
Tifa still didn't look any better. Cloud decided to leave her to Elmira while he walked upstairs towards Eris's room. The door to her bedroom was open, and he could hear Barrett and Elmira inside. He could mostly hear Barrett's voice, and as he peeked into Eris's room he saw Barrett standing inside, with Marlene wrapped up in his arms.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you're all right,
he was saying. Marlene was struggling hard to get away from him.
Daddy, don't cry. Your whiskers hurt.
Cloud smiled a little, and turned to leave them to it. He must have made some kind of noise, for as he turned, Barrett put Marlene down on the ground and turned to Cloud.
Cloud.
Cloud stopped and turned to Barrett.
You're gonna go help Eris, right? She's done so much for me. If it's the Shinra you're dealing with, I can't just sit here. I'm coming, too.
Cloud smiled. He figured Barrett would do that. Marlene squeezed past her father and ran to Cloud.
Guess what? Guess what?
The little girl asked him excitedly. Cloud knelt down beside her to listen.
Eris was asking me lots of questions. Like what kind of person Cloud is. I bet she likes you, Cloud. Let's hope so,
he said, his face turning red a little. Marlene instantly covered her mouth and giggled. She glanced back at Barrett, before leaning in closer to Cloud and whispering in his ear.
I won't tell Tifa,
she promised. Cloud sighed heavily. He then left Barrett and Marlene alone and went back downstairs to where Tifa was still waiting with Elmira. Tifa looked a little calmer now, so he figured that Elmira's words of encouragement had helped in cheering the poor girl up. He walked right past Tifa, his mind made up, and headed towards the door.
You're going after Eris, right?
Cloud stopped beside the door, and turned to Tifa.
Yeah,
he said. He didn't mention that he was still effectively being hired as her bodyguard, and he had a responsibility to protect her. Tifa nodded.
I'm coming with you, she said. We're going right into Shinra headquarters,
Cloud warned her.
You gotta be prepared for the worst. I know,
said Tifa.
Right now, I feel I have to push myself to the limit. If I stayed here, I'll go crazy.
A loud rumble came from the stairs as Barrett tore down towards them, and came to a stop in front of Elmira.
Sorry, but can you take care of Marlene a bit longer?
He asked her. Elmira nodded.
Yes, I don't mind, she said. This place is dangerous now,
he said.
You better go somewhere else. You're right,
Elmira agreed gravely. She looked up at Barrett.
But promise me that you'll come back to her. Don't get yourself killed.
Barrett turned to Tifa and Cloud, who were looking back at him. They all nodded together in agreement, and then ran out of Elmira's house, ready to begin their mission to rescue Eris. End of chapter. Episode 17, Part 01, Chapter 17. Chapter 17.
How do we get to the Shinra building?
Asked Tifa once they were standing outside of Eris's house.
There ain't no train that goes up there anymore,
said Barrett. Tifa crossed her arms and thought for a moment.
Well,
she said finally.
Let's just go to Wall Market. We might be able to find something there.
Cloud and Barrett nodded. Wall Market was in Sector 6, and logically that seemed to be the best place to start in their search to find a way up to Shinra headquarters, which was situated in the large tower in the center of Midgar. So they left Eris's house behind them and headed quickly towards Sector 6. It was a painful thing to do as they passed through the park again and look upon the smoldering pile of wreckage that was formerly the plate. The fires were slowly beginning to die down now, and there were still no signs of life. They didn't stop to look at the wreckage or to mourn over their lost comrades, they were on a mission now, and there was nothing they could do for their friends now. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse were dead, but they would never be forgotten. Sector 6 was also in a state of panic like Sector 5, although by now the people were beginning to calm down and return to their nightly lives, left only to wonder how and why the Sector 7 plate had fallen. There were a few pieces of debris scattered around from when the plate crashed, but nothing was seriously damaged. One thing Cloud did notice as he walked through the sector with Tifa and Barrett were the expressions of some of the people who were looking at him. Many of the people, in particular the men, were looking at Cloud with sneering looks and pointing at him, laughing amongst themselves knowingly. At first Cloud was confused, until he was hit with a terrible flashback of how he had to walk through the sector clad in a purple silk dress and blonde wig. The people here had obviously heard of his escapade in Corneo's mansion, and now he had become the laughing stock of Sector 6. He walked faster through the sector, wanting to get away from the staring, jeering eyes of the men. For a while they wandered through the sector, trying to find something that could give them a lead to making it up to the upper plate and towards the Shinra HQ. They questioned a few people, but no one really knew or didn't care. The further north they headed into the middle of the sector, the more debris there was that had fallen from the sky when the plate crashed. Most of the debris had been gathered outside the weapon store, where a man was busy hauling a large broken chunk of metal that looked like an engine of sorts inside through the back door. Cloud signaled to Barrett and Tifa to wait while he went inside the weapons store. He found the man at the back of the store, with the large broken engine lying next to him as he worked on it. For a moment or two Cloud just looked at the various weapons that had been manufactured within the store, unsure of what he was really looking for to help him and the others get to the upper levels. He eventually caught the shop owner's attention, and the man looked up at him.
"You going up to the plate?"
he asked suddenly. Clearly word spread fast throughout the sector. He stood up and wiped his hands on a dirty old cloth covered in oil.
"You better have a battery,"
he advised Cloud, walking to the fence that separated him and Cloud, and held out a small box of large square-shaped batteries. They looked pretty battered and dented, but they had obviously been fixed. Cloud tilted his head as he looked at the box.
"You're gonna sell me something you just found?"
he asked.
"Hey, you knew?"
the shop owner asked. He shrugged dismissively.
"But I repaired it, so it's all right. Why do I need a battery to climb up to the plate?"
The shop owner grinned knowingly.
"You'll find out when you get there,"
he said.
"How about 100 gil for each?"
Cloud looked down at the freshly repaired batteries, unsure as to why he would really need them in order to get to the plate. Then he remembered that the people of the slums were desperate for money, and the shopkeeper had no real reason to lie to him.
"All right, I'll take them,"
Cloud said finally. He delved into his pocket and pulled out 300 gil, exactly enough for the 3 batteries that lay in the box. He handed the shopkeeper the money through a large hole in the fence, and the owner in turn pushed the box of batteries through a similar hole. Once Cloud took the batteries, the shop owner turned back to his job of repairing the engine he had carted into the shop. Cloud left the shop to where Tifa and Barrett were waiting for him. They looked at him in bewilderment as they saw the 3 batteries he had purchased, but they didn't say anything. They continued to head north, back up towards the section of the sector where Don Corneo's mansion was built. As they approached, Cloud and Tifa saw that the mansion was now dark and all the lights were switched off. In fact, the mansion looked entirely deserted.
"Wanna see something awesome?"
came a young voice. The 3 turned to the sound of the voice. It came from a young boy, standing with a group of his friends near the entrance of the mansion beside a fairly dark alley. Cloud and his friends looked on as his friends nodded excitedly, and the boy turned to the alley.
"Follow me,"
he said. And with that the boy turned and ran into the alley, with his friends running excitedly behind him. Cloud looked to Tifa and Barrett, who slowly nodded their heads. The mansion ran along the back of the wall that joined with Sector 7, and any lead, no matter how small, was better than nothing. So they headed down the alley after the children. As they entered the clearing behind the alley, they were surprised to find that the kids had all disappeared, with the exception of one young girl who was standing almost frightened beside the wall that separated the 2 sectors, which had been covered with graffiti. A long, thick cable was hanging near the side of the wall, and as Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett looked up they saw that the cable was coming from the remains of the cables and tubes that had previously been holding the Sector 7 plate Indiana Place and now were hanging down loosely all the way to the slums.
"Everyone climbed up this wire,"
the young girl said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at the size of the wall and how high the wire climbed.
"Looks scary." "Brr. Can we climb it?"
Tifa asked the young girl. She nodded in reply.
"Yeah. It leads to the upper world." "Alright,"
Barrett exclaimed.
"We'll climb this wire."
Cloud turned to him.
"There's no way we can do this,"
he protested.
"You know how far it goes up." "There is a way,"
Barrett insisted. He turned to the wire.
"Look. What's that look like?"
Cloud looked at the wire, wondering what it was that Barrett could see that he couldn't. To him it was just a long black cable dangling from the wreckage above them. It was a thick wire and looked strong and sturdy enough, but apart from that it wasn't anything special.
"Just a normal wire,"
Cloud replied finally.
"Oh yeah?"
asked Barrett.
"Well, to me it looks like a golden shiny wire of hope."
Together Cloud and Tifa looked up at the wire once more and the ruins that lay beyond it. Even though they couldn't see all the way up to the top, it did seem as though it led all the way towards the upper plate.
"You're right,"
said Tifa. She turned to the 2 men.
"This is the only way to save Eris." "Okay," said Cloud. "That was a bad analogy, but Barrett, I understand how you feel."
He looked at Tifa and Barrett, who nodded back at him. He then nodded.
"Let's go,"
he said, sounding enthusiastic. He then turned towards the cable behind him. He jumped up, grabbed onto it, pulled himself up and began to climb. Barrett followed him, using most of his upper body strength to pull him up the wire since he had only one hand he could use to climb with. Tifa was last to jump onto the wire, which meant she was also the last to see the horrors that awaited them at the top of the wall. The rest of the girl's friends were all standing on the top of the old concrete wall, gasping and exclaiming in delight and fear as they looked at what lay beyond the wall, and as Cloud climbed up and looked in, he also gasped. He could see directly into what remained of Sector 7. Of course, he could not see the slums, for they were buried deep beneath the plate. What he was looking at was what was left of the town built on top of the plate, which was just a large, smoldering wreckage. The metal of the plate and the houses were all broken up and distorted, twisted around into the most unbelievable positions. Electric cables had broken and were crackling, everything was a ruin. However, despite the devastation, there would be a small chance of people on top of the plate surviving, but less could be said for those trapped under the plate.
Oh man! This is terrible!
One kid wailed as he looked down at the wreckage.
Hey, scary, hey!
His friend said.
Dad told me that it's the Shinra's doing.
Barrett stared into the wreckage, his eyes opening wide as he saw the devastation. He knew that deep beneath that wreckage were Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, buried forever, for he doubted the Shinra would lift up the plate. He was slightly relieved to know that at least some people knew that Shinra was to blame for this tragedy and not Avalanche, so the Shinra's attempts to blacken their appearance had failed. Tifa refused to let herself look down into the wreckage, she didn't want to see the charred, messed up graveyard that Sector 7 had become. They continued to climb the wire past the children, and headed up into the deep maze of broken pipes and chunks of metal that had lodged in the air from the top of the Sector 6 plate. The cable eventually came to an end a little further up, and the group climbed onto the large pipe that it was dangling from. From there they looked around to see which would be the safest way of going up. The pipes twisted around each other, many of them dented and broken from the disaster, and many ladders had been bent completely out of shape. There was one ladder that had been dented so it made a dip before rising up again towards another pipe that led higher up towards the upper world. There was a fan next to it, although the blades were a little out of reach right then. Cloud jumped from the pipe they were standing on and onto the pipe that held the fan. The blades were too strong to be pushed into place, but there was a small square box near the foot of the fan, and as he looked inside he could see that it was a battery slot. He then realized that this was what the weapons store owner meant when he sold Cloud the batteries.
Maybe if I put a battery in?
He wondered aloud, looking down at the 3 batteries.
The propeller might work. I guess I'll just have to believe the shopkeeper.
Tifa and Barrett watched hopefully as Cloud pushed one of the 3 batteries into the slot. It was a struggle to get the battery in since everything was so rusty, but he eventually got the battery in and a light lit up on the side of the fan. Slowly, the blades of the fan began to turn. They creaked loudly as rust broke away from their hinges, fighting the urge to stop and beginning to turn slowly. They began to speed up a little, absorbing the power of the battery and turning around for the first time in years. It wasn't the fault of the fan when the light suddenly exploded and the blades began to slow down again. The battery was very old and had been very hastily repaired, so it was no wonder that the battery lost its power very quickly and began to die out. Cloud watched as the blades began to slow down, and sighed with relief as they stopped, with one blade stopping right beside the pipe that led onto the ladder they needed to get to. The group wasted no time in continuing their long journey up to the upper world. With the blades now in place they were able to climb onto the pipe and then onto the ladder, which was stuck firmly in place between the 2 pipes. After the ladder then began to climb the pipes, using the dents and ridges as handholds and footholds for them to hold onto so they wouldn't fall to the ground, which was already a long way behind them. They came to a stop again as a large metal bar blocked their path on a pipe further up, which was easily removed as Cloud but the second of the 3 batteries in a nearby box. The bar lifted up with a loud creak, allowing the group to pass. The pipe itself ended a little further on, but the pipe on the other side of the abyss looked as though it continued to rise. There was, of course, a large gap between that pipe and the one they were standing on, with only a gently swinging bar between them.
Looks like the only way is to jump onto that bar,
Cloud assumed.
Should make it if I jump before it comes too close.
Tifa and Barrett looked at him confused, and exclaimed loudly as Cloud suddenly dived off the pipe towards the bar. Tifa cried out and covered her eyes, unable to watch in case Cloud fell. Cloud caught hold of the bar as it swung towards him, and held on with all his strength. With the extra weight now on the bar it began to swing more strongly, and with each swing he got closer to the other pipe. When he was close enough he released his hold on the bar and fell onto the pipe, quickly grabbing onto the ridges to stop him from falling off. He signaled to Barrett to follow, and Tifa sighed with relief as she opened her eyes and saw Cloud was safe. The rest of the journey was fairly simple once the bar obstacle had been passed. There were no other blockages or jumps to make, no pipes to cross over, just a straight journey straight up towards the upper world. Everything was fairly quiet on the upper plate surrounding the Shinra building. The tower itself was lit up with many searchlights that were rolling around the sky. A single helicopter was flying overhead examining the wreckage of Sector 7. Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa stood together near the entrance of the Shinra building, looking up at it in the darkness. Cloud had one hand grasped onto the handle of his sword, while Barrett's gun arm was raised and ready, and Tifa pushed her gloves firmly into place for the inevitable battles that lay ahead. Slowly Cloud turned his head towards his friends, who nodded back at him. Cloud then turned back to the building, and then the three of them began to run to the Shinra building, the rescue mission that would unwind the rest of their stories finally beginning. End of chapter. Episode 18, Part 01, Chapter 18. Chapter 18. Cloud and the two Avalanche members stopped just outside the entrance to the Shinra building and looked up at the tower looming above them. The building was very tall, and must have had at least 60 floors built into it. This was the central control for all of Midgar, where all the decisions relating to the city were made. This was where President Shinra would have given the order to destroy Sector 7 and take the lives of so many. The Shinra president would be in that building somewhere, being protected by his guards and followers. And, of course, Eris would be in that building too, although they didn't know where.
Hey, you ought to know this building well,
Barrett said suddenly to Cloud as they looked up at the Shinra building together. Cloud shook his head.
Not really,
he admitted. He folded his arms and thought silently for a moment.
Now that I think of it, this is the first time I've ever been to the headquarters. I heard about this place before,
Barrett began to explain. He walked past Cloud and Tifa and looked straight up at the tall, looming tower.
Every floor above the 60th is special and not easy to get to even for employees. Must be where they took Eris. Alright, let's go.
He ran forward towards the entrance of the building.
Wait a second.
Tifa called out suddenly, and Barrett came to a stop and looked back at her irritably.
You're not thinking of just going right through the main entrance, are you? Well, what does it look like?
Barrett asked, as though the answer was obvious.
I'm gonna kick some Shinra butt and... That's not going to work.
Tifa protested, her voice anxious.
We've got to find another way.
Barrett's eyes twitched impatiently.
Ain't gonna be another way.
He roared irately at her, growing angry at Tifa's protests.
If we keep wasting time like this, Eris'll... I know that,
said Tifa.
But if we get caught here...
She sighed heavily and shook her head. She was getting nowhere arguing with Barrett, for he had a mind like a brick wall, very hard to change. She then had an idea and turned to Cloud.
Hey, Cloud. What should we do?
Up until that point Cloud had been looking up at the Shinra building whilst listening to Tifa and Barrett argue over how they should break in. The tower was very, very tall, and even though he had never been inside the building before, he knew that it would be very well protected. It was probably the only place in Midgar that wasn't run down and rusty, since this was the most important place in Midgar. There might not have been any guards standing around the outside of the building, but he knew that inside there would probably be hundreds of guards waiting for them, as well as soldier and anything else Shinra had ready in their defense. He looked at Tifa.
Let's sneak in quietly,
he answered. After all, they were on a rescue mission, and they didn't want to be caught before they even found out where Eris was.
See?
Tifa asked triumphantly, grinning at Barrett.
Let's see if we can find a different route.
Barrett growled angrily and shook his fist at Cloud and Tifa as they turned and walked away from him, heading towards the long, wide alleyway that wound around the side of the Shinra building. As much as Barrett hated to admit it, Tifa was right. To just enter the building with guns blazing would just be a suicide mission, not a rescue mission. He looked at the double doors leading into the building, resisting the urge to just run in and shoot like crazy. Instead, he was able to hold back his desire and followed Cloud and Tifa into the alley. They had stopped just a little further ahead after finding a door that led into the Shinra building, kind of like a back door. Tifa pulled on the door handle as Barrett caught up with them, and was surprised to find the door was unlocked and opened easily. Cloud let Tifa go in first before he followed her, and lastly Barrett walked through, and they were inside the Shinra building. As they walked through and saw what was beyond, the three stopped and stared, their heads slowly looking upwards. The door led to a long staircase, a very long staircase. The stairs wound round and round above them, going up each floor of the tower, which was at least 60 floors high. Barrett blinked, gazing upon the stairs, amazed at how high they went. The tower looked high on its own, but to look at it from this perspective, made it seem even higher.
Yo!
He said aloud, his voice filled with awe.
You really gonna take these stairs all the way up?
Tifa gave him a sideways glance.
Well, we've got to get to Eris to help her somehow,
she replied.
Talk about out of the way. I don't have time to argue with you.
The young woman shouted, her fists clenched and shaking angrily. She stepped onto the stairs and frowned back at Barrett, her brown eyes glaring.
I'm going.
And with that she turned away from the two men and began to run up the stairs, regardless of how high she was going to have to go to reach the top. She reached the first floor after a couple of turns on the winding staircase and carried on, refusing to stop or wait for Cloud and Barrett.
Why yo, Tifa?
Barrett called after her.
Don't go off alone.
He and Cloud began to run after her up the stairs, since there was no other way they could get up there other than this staircase. They caught up to Tifa fairly easily since they were both stronger and faster than the young woman, but after a while even they began to feel the strain of fatigue. Tifa's hair was flying around her face as she ran, and she had to keep pushing it out of the way. Barrett was panting heavily, and was already beginning to complain again.
Don't know. Why? The hell? We gotta climb. Because we don't want to start a commotion until we've saved Eris,
Cloud replied simply. He was beginning to pant with fatigue as well. He looked down at the ground as he ran.
I doubt that's possible, though.
Barrett smiled to himself.
Ha, ha, ha,
he laughed quietly. Cloud's head snapped round to look at Barrett.
Knock it off,
he ordered.
You're giving me the creeps.
They fell silent for a while as they ran up the next 10 levels or so. As they reached the 18th floor or so, Barrett looked up at Cloud.
So even you will fight for someone else,
he said.
I had you figured wrong, I guess. Who cares what you figured?
Cloud snapped.
I'm just saying maybe I was wrong. Ha, ha, ha.
Tifa laughed a little to herself. Now Cloud snapped his head round to Tifa.
What's that supposed to mean, Tifa?
He demanded. Tifa didn't answer him, but the knowing smile remained on her face as she ran on. As she ran she grabbed her hair and threw it back behind her and out of her face, which was hot and red from the running. She passed Barrett as he stopped for a moment to catch his breath before he carried on running. She had no idea what floor they were on now, she had lost track after maybe the 12th floor or so, but it didn't really matter because they were still going up anyway.
How much farther do these stairs go on?
Barrett asked suddenly, breaking the silence to complain again. Tifa rolled her eyes.
Why don't you ask them?
She suggested to him sarcastically.
It's not one of them endless stairways or something, do you think? Of course not.
Tifa replied, beginning to grow very annoyed at Barrett's constant complaining.
Right?
Barrett said, slowly nodding his head.
Couldn't be that.
He continued to run along after Tifa and Cloud. They were probably only halfway up the seemingly endless staircase now, but still seemed a long way to the top to them. By now weariness had truly set in. Their legs burned intensely as they ran, and their chests heaved with each breath they took. They were gradually slowing down in speed but refused to stop.
Are we there yet?
Barrett asked suddenly.
Not yet,
replied Tifa. There was a pause for a moment or two as they turned a couple of corners on the stairs, before Barrett spoke again.
There yet. I said not yet.
Tifa retorted. They fell silent once again.
Yo. Look, don't even ask.
Tifa snarled furiously, turning her head around and glaring at Barrett with such an enraged look at both Barrett and Cloud felt a little scared.
We're way far away from being there, okay?
She turned away from them and pushed herself harder, beginning to pull away from the two as her anger powered her on as extra energy. Barrett didn't say anything else for a while and just ran on in silence, wishing inside his mind that this long trek was over with. Cloud stopped on the stairs for a moment to catch his breath, his sword feeling like a dead weight on his back. There was no time for him to adjust it now, so he began to run again, his legs also beginning to feel dead. He soon began to catch up to Tifa and Barrett, and could already hear Barrett's voice.
Damn, man. I've had it. I'm going back. And take just as long going down as you did coming up.
Cloud turned a corner on the stairs and came to a stop again. Barrett and Tifa had both stopped just ahead of him, with Barrett keeling over and panting hard, his face red with lack of air in his lungs. Tifa was at the top of the stairs ahead of him, her face also red, but she managed to find enough energy to make a face at Barrett as he stood panting like a weakling in front of her.
Come on, Barrett. Pull it together,
she said, trying to encourage him. Barrett refused to look up at her.
Yeah, well, all I know is I'm just flesh and blood,
he replied. He looked down at his gun arm that was supporting him on his knee and stopping him collapsing.
Except for this arm of mine. Don't treat me like I'm some ex-member of soldier or something.
Cloud raised an eyebrow. Tifa put her hands on her hips indignantly.
What about me?
She demanded.
I'm human too. Oh, do what you want, I'm going on.
She turned away and began to head up the stairs once more, as always leaving Barrett and Cloud behind her. However, after a few steps she suddenly stopped and turned back to the two. Yeah! She screamed mockingly.
Barrett! You go first. What are you ignorant?
Barrett asked her.
I didn't mean that.
Tifa grinned as she ran over to him.
All right,
she said, but still motioned for Barrett to go on ahead of her. Barrett did so, shaking his head as he took a few steps before he began to run again. Tifa looked at Cloud.
Cloud, you go on ahead, too,
she added, and only waited until Cloud began to run ahead of her before she also began to run, a fairly smug smile on her face. And so they continued their seemingly endless trek up the stairs of the Shinra building. The ground floor was now a long way beneath them, and it was very nauseating to look down and see the drop, so no one dared to look. They only looked at the stairs as they passed by beneath them, step after step.
Yo!
Barrett said through each panting breath.
What floor is this?
Tifa shrugged.
I gave up counting,
she admitted. Barrett narrowed his eyes and glared at each step he ran on.
Why they gotta build these buildings so damn tall?
He asked aloud.
That Shinra. They're just no damn good.
Was Tifa's only reply, and they continued to run. They had to stop a couple of more times as they ran, trying to catch their breath and moving on again before the others would get too far ahead, although by the time they caught up that person would also have stopped for breath. Their legs were heavy and sore from the running, their lungs desperate for breath.
Huff. Man, I'm beat,
Barrett said, beginning to complain once again. This time Tifa didn't acknowledge the complaint, she'd just be wasting her breath. Barrett raised his eyes to the ceiling far above them, although his mind was focused on something else.
Marlene,
he whispered.
Daddy wants to see your face one more time.
Now Tifa reacted.
Would you stop acting like a retard and climb?
She raged, her temper rising once again.
It's just a bit more. Maybe.
She added quietly to herself, for now even she was beginning to wonder if the stairs would ever end and they would reach the top. Luckily, they didn't have to go much farther to reach the top. Just a couple of floors later the stairs finally came to a stop as they reached the top level of the Shinra building, or at least as high as the stairs went up the building. A single door that was lying ajar lay at the top of the stairs leading the way into the building, which was a great sight to see after their long and arduous climb. The three were extremely relieved to finally stop and rest their legs, leaning over with their hands on their knees to hold them up as they panted hard, sweat pouring down their faces, their legs and chests aching.
F.
Barrett panted, breathing deeply as he tried to catch his breath. He tried to speak again.
Finally. M. Made it. N. Never wanna see. No more stairs for the rest of my life.
He pushed himself firmly upright and walked through the open door into the building.
Puff. Puff.
Tifa breathed, her throat dry.
This really takes it out of you. But this is it. We'd better get ready.
She also stood up and walked through the door, leaving Cloud to follow last through the door and finally into the building. They emerged onto floor 59 of the Shinra building, which was as far as the normal employees of Shinra were allowed to go. Two red-suited Shinra guards to prevent unauthorized entry guarded the lifts at the far end of the level, and no doubt there was some special security within the lift to prevent people going any higher than they were allowed to. At that time, the guards were the only people on the floor, which was a relief as the guards spotted the group heading towards them, and in particular spotted their weapons ready for battle.
Destroy the intruders!
One of the guards shouted, and the two soldiers ran towards the group. Cloud and Barrett were about to run forward with their weapons to attack the guards, but Tifa beat them to it as she ran forward to meet them. She was tired from all the running, but she was energized by the anger she felt when she remembered what Shinra did to the people of Sector 7, and didn't want anyone to get in her way. She drew back her fist and punched the first guard as she met him in the middle of the floor. She punched so hard that her glove smashed through the glass visor of his helmet, sending glass flying through the air. The soldier fell back and cried out as sharp shards of glass fell into his eyes. Tifa turned sharply as she heard the sound of a click behind her. Without a single hesitation, she jumped up into the air, straightening her legs as she jumped in preparation for a kick. As she turned in the air, she kicked sideways, knocking the rifle from the second guard's hands as he prepared to fire at her. The gun went clattering onto the floor next to Tifa and the guard, but Tifa wasn't finished with the guard just yet. As she landed, she grabbed hold of the guard with her gloved hands and pulled him harshly towards her. At the same time, she raised one knee and kneed him hard in the face, also smashing the visor that shielded him. Then she punched him in the chest, a punch so powerful that the soldier was thrown back and onto the floor, falling limp as the power of Tifa's fists overcame him. By that point, the first soldier had recovered and was running towards Tifa once again. Tifa was quicker however, and quickly crouched down and swept one leg around her as she soldier approached. The Shinra guard tripped up over her leg and began to fall down on top of her, but by that time Tifa had already let herself fall onto her back and was ready to catch him as he fell. She didn't hold him for long, for she put one leg underneath the guard's chest and pushed, throwing him up into the air and over her. He also went flying and crashed into a wall at the other end of the floor, and didn't get up again. As he flew, something fell from his pocket and skidded across the floor, stopping by Cloud's boots. Cloud and Barrett could only stare in absolute amazement as Tifa climbed to her feet and began to brush herself off, her anger and rage now gone once she had let it out. She caught their surprised gazes looking at her, and merely looked at the two with an innocent expression.
"What?"
she asked.
"Nothing,"
Barrett answered quickly. He knew that Tifa was an expert martial artist, but never before had he seen so much aggression and power within her. She was a lot stronger than she looked. Cloud looked at Tifa before he looked at the ground and spotted the item that had fallen from one of the guard's pockets. He knelt down.
"What's this?"
he muttered, and picked it up. It looked like some kind of security card with the number 60 printed on it in large, bold letters. Cloud stared for a moment before he realized what it was. It was a key card, specially designed to unlock the secret floors of the Shinra building. This particular one was marked 60, which meant that with it they could use the lift and go on up to the 60th floor, the first of a few secret floors. He walked past Barrett and Tifa as they moved the two guards out of sight and up to one of the two lifts that the two soldiers had been guarding. Inside the lift was the control panel used to choose the designated floor, and a swipe slot. Cloud swiped the key card through the slot just as Barrett and Tifa entered the lift beside him. The control panel beeped for a few seconds before a green light flashed, and the lift doors shut behind them. There was a shudder as the lift began to move upwards, and Cloud turned to Barrett and Tifa.
"This is the real thing,"
Barrett warned them all.
"Don't let your guard down." "I hope Eris is all right,"
said Tifa. End of chapter. Episode 19, Part 01, Chapter 19. Chapter 19. A single Shinra guard slept peacefully in his chair in the security room, unaware of everything that was going on in the rest of the building. All around him the many television monitors were focused on different parts of the upper levels of the Shinra headquarters. The green lights on each of the monitors signaled that everything was okay and there was no cause for concern, so the Shinra guard thought it would be safe to take a nap. However, as he slept, one of the monitor's lights changed from green to red and flashed brightly, although the guard did not stir. The monitor was showing two lifts on the 60th floor, and in particular the one that was just opening and releasing the 3 intruders that were gathered inside. But the Shinra guard was fast asleep and lost in his own world of dreams, and so he did not see the 3 as they began to pile out of the lift. Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett piled out of the lift and stood on floor 60 of the Shinra building, and quickly headed off into a small room at the side to avoid being seen. This floor was different in structure to the previous floor, and was a little better guarded. The middle of the floor was empty but was bordered by 4 guards that patrolled in pairs back and forth each of the different sections, peering through each pillar to catch any unwary intruders. At the far end of the floor was another small room that was the staircase leading to the upper levels, but the guards were right across the floor, blocking their only way across.
Look at that, all them guards is running around,
Barrett growled angrily as the 3 of them peeked through the second door leading out of the side room and at the guards as they patrolled behind the pillars.
Cloud, you go on ahead and signal us when it's safe to come.
Cloud didn't protest and went to the door to get a closer look at the guards' patrolling pattern. The 4 guards were split into 2 pairs that were patrolling different sections of the floor. The first 2 guards closest to them were patrolling behind the first 3 pillars, stopping at the large structure in the middle of the floor. They seemed to walk at the same time, stopping between the pillars to peer through. Their movements were fairly regular, so he figured it would actually be an easy task to make their way across. He slipped out of the door and towards the first pillar. He pressed himself against it and looked back through the corner of his eye to see the 2 guards walking towards him on the other side of the pillar. He saw them stop, and then turn away and began to walk back, and it was only then that Cloud made a quick, quiet dash for the next pillar. He made it just as the soldiers turned and headed back again. He stood silent behind the middle pillar, with a soldier on either side of him on the other side of the pillar. A few moments later the soldiers turned and headed further down towards the first pillars, and it was then that Cloud made his dash for the third and final pillar before daring to make a dash for the middle structure. He leaned back against it and sighed heavily, relieved to have made it halfway across the floor without being seen. But now he had to get the others across. Barrett was already waiting in the doorway for Cloud to signal to him. Now that Cloud was in the middle he could see the soldiers a lot better and where they were. He waited until the soldiers were moving towards him before he signaled to Barrett to move forward. Barrett slid quietly out of the door and stopped behind the first pillar as Cloud signaled for him to stop. When the soldiers began to move again, Cloud signaled for Barrett to move again, until he joined Cloud in the middle, and he began to signal to Tifa to move across. Moving to the other end of the floor was just as simple as the first part. Cloud went first, moving across the pillars one by one past the soldiers until he reached the very last pillar, which stopped near the door leading to the stairs. He stayed by this pillar and signaled for Barrett and Tifa to come across one at a time. They had a close call as Tifa stepped out a little too early, stepping back again just in time before a soldier spotted her, and then they would have been caught and all their efforts so far would have been for nothing. Once they were all safely across the floor, they all headed into the room with the stairs leading up to the next floor. Barrett grinned haughtily in his own pride.
Okay.
He cheered, now that they were free to talk openly again.
We're gonna rock. Remember, we're here to save Eris,
Tifa reminded him sternly. Barrett turned to her.
Hell, I know that.
He snapped. With that the 3 headed on up towards the 61st floor. As they walked up to the next floor they were surprised to find that the door leading into the level was unlocked and left wide open, so much for security. Of course they couldn't head straight up to the 62nd floor, for that door had been left locked. So they decided to brave the danger and headed out onto the 61st floor in search of a keycard that would unlock the next floor for them. The 61st floor seemed to be a large common room for the staff that worked in the Shinra building. It was wide and vast, with wooden tables and chairs scattered around for people to sit and relax in while they enjoyed their lunch breaks. There were numerous people walking around or sitting down, clearly the Shinra kept people working even at night. The floor was quite nicely decorated with a number of green plants and shrubbery around, and it seemed like a pleasant floor compared to the rest of Midgar. Obviously this wasn't the kind of place Shinra would keep their prisoners in, so Eris was not on this floor.
The hell are you?
Came a voice.
What are you doing around here?
Cloud and his group turned sharply to look behind them, and jumped to find a Shinra executive standing directly behind them, looking at them with a suspicious look on his face. It was no surprise to them that they looked suspicious with their armor and weaponry, but they didn't think they would have stuck out that much. Cloud mumbled quietly, struggling to find a believable answer.
Oh, I see,
the executive said suddenly.
You must be that whatcha call it.
He tapped his head for a moment, before he clicked his fingers.
Shinra Inc., Repair Division. You know, it looks like this building is starting to fall apart.
He pointed to the door that the group had just come through.
This door was just pushed open. You ought to fix this right away. Oh yeah, and take a look on the other floors too. I'll give you this.
He pulled out a keycard imprinted with the number 62 on it, and handed it to Cloud. Then he walked away, leaving Cloud blinking in his confusion. Then he shrugged. At least they had gotten hold of a keycard leading to a higher floor. So they turned and headed out to the stairs again, swiping the card through the slot beside the door that led onto the next floor, and stepped through. The next level was Shinra's official library, which contained all their books relating to their weaponry, defense, planet study, and anything else they had a department of. One section of the library was even about space exploration, which seemed confusing to Cloud and his group since no one had ever made it into space, and didn't even know that Shinra had a space program. A single light was coming from a room at the far end of the library. With nowhere else to go, Cloud and his group went towards it. There was a large metal plate bolted onto the door, with the word Mayor engraved into the metal. Cloud glanced at Barrett and Tifa. None of them had ever met the Mayor of Midgar before, in fact, not many people had seen him. Most people had probably forgotten by now that there ever was a mayor, since Shinra had most of the control in the city. Even so, the mayor was an important person, and should be able to provide them with a key card to the higher levels. And if he wouldn't give it to them willingly. Barrett loaded his gun. Cloud then pushed the door open. The inside of the office looked just like a librarian's office, and not the kind of room suitable for someone as important as the mayor. There were numerous boxes full of papers around, and files containing reports and other things. The mayor himself was sat in a chair at the far end of the room, mumbling quietly to himself as he looked over some documents. He looked up as he heard the door shut behind him, and looked at the three standing behind him, their weapons at the ready.
Oh, and who might you be?
He asked of them. He stared for a few moments, eyeing over their weapons. He nodded slightly.
You all must be those. Ahem.
He stopped himself just in time.
Me? I'm Domino, the mayor of Midgar. Actually, I'm mayor in name only. The city and everything in it's really run by Shinra, Incorporated. My only real job is watching over Shinra's documents. Me. The mayor. A librarian.
He stopped as he saw the irritated faces of Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa glaring back at him. They had no time for idle chat with a man who was depressed about his job and what it had become, and they certainly had no time to hear his life story. Domino seemed to read this in their faces and nodded his head.
Ah. You want to get upstairs?
He assumed, folding his arms.
I'll tell you what, if you can guess the password, I'll give you my keycard. Yes, that's it. Guess the password and I'll give you my keycard. Get it on the first try and I'll even throw in a special item.
The three standing at the end of the room each raised an eyebrow. Domino sounded like he should be presenting a quiz show, and not being the mayor of Midgar. They turned to one another and began to mutter quietly amongst themselves, trying to come up with something that could be the password. Without any clues, it was a tough decision to make, and they could go on for hours just guessing passwords. And that was time they didn't have. While Tifa and Barrett muttered quietly, arguing again as to whether Barrett should just shoot the mayor and take his keycard, Cloud looked around the office. There were papers strewn everywhere, but there was only one that caught his eye. It was a scientific report about Mako and materia. The word Mako on the report had been circled in a bright red pen, along with a little drawing that he thought was the mayor holding Mako in his hands. He tapped Tifa on the shoulder and pointed to it. Cloud then stood upright and turned to the mayor. The mayor was waiting patiently.
Got it?
He asked. Cloud nodded.
Then tell me. So, what's the password?
Cloud glanced back at Barrett and Tifa, before turning back to Domino.
Mako?
He asked. Domino stared blankly for a moment, before a large grin spread on his face.
Mako!
He exclaimed, his voice loud and joyous.
God, I love the sound of that. Mako! If I had a lot more of it, I would be a real mayor. Well, okay. Here, take it.
He pulled out his keycard, which was imprinted with the number 65, and handed it to Cloud.
I never thought you would get it on the first try.
Domino admitted, scratching his head.
Just goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover. Oh well, a promise is a promise. Take this, too.
He delved into his pocket again and pulled out a small ball of materia. Judging by its color, Cloud guessed it was elemental materia, which was very useful in certain situations. He was about to ask Domino a question, but Domino answered it before he could even ask.
Why would I do something like this, you ask?
He said. He narrowed his eyes fiercely.
To mess with them, of course. Shinra's been torturing me forever. That's why I was a little rough on you all just now. Now go up there and really make them suffer. This ought to make us even. Ha ha ha.
Cloud and his friends quickly left the cackling mayor, thinking he had maybe lost a few marbles while he had been cooped up in that office working for Shinra. They headed back to the stairs and used the high-level keycard to make their way up towards level 65. They passed level 63, which looked like some kind of maze, and level 64, which was the gym and resting area. They stopped at level 65 and looked around. It was a floor with a number of small rooms at the side around the perimeter, with one large room in the middle. From what they could see, this floor was empty and they were free to move around. They headed into the large room. There was a large model built in the middle of the room, and it looked like a large model of the city of Midgar. It was identical in almost every way, including the layout of the plates and reactors. The model, however, was incomplete, as some pieces of the model, particularly those parts of the plates, were missing.
A model of Midgar.
Cloud breathed quietly as they all looked upon the model.
Born from Mako, sucked right out of the earth. Parts of the model are missing,
Tifa pointed out, pointing at the empty slots in the model. Cloud turned to look behind him, where one part of the Midgar model was resting on the floor. He picked it up and began to place it in one of the Midgar model slots. It fitted in perfectly in the slot for the Sector 1 plate. There were more pieces scattered around the rest of the room, so the group all worked together to put the remaining slots in place. As they finished putting last piece in place, incidentally, the piece that represented the plate for Sector 7, a loud click could be heard from somewhere in the room.
Sounds like something opened up,
said Cloud. He walked slowly around the edge of the Midgar model, looking down into the model for something that could have unlocked once they had finished putting in all the pieces. He stopped beside the unfinished section of the model that represented the only unfinished sector in Midgar, Sector 8. Curious, he reached inside the model. He felt around for a moment until his hand clasped around something small and rectangular, and he pulled it out. Sure enough, it was a keycard, imprinted with the number 66. An employee must have dropped it in there during the model's construction, and it must have been there for a long time. However, that didn't matter, and they quickly headed up towards the 66th floor, feeling certain that they were getting closer and closer to Eris. The next floor was very busy and people were walking around everywhere. They were mainly secretaries carrying files to other offices, and inside the offices the other employees were working hard throughout the night. They were so busy with their own affairs they took no notice of Cloud and the others as they walked cautiously past them, looking for someone who looked like they had the authority to get up to the next levels, since it was also clear that Eris was not being held on this floor. As they turned a corner towards the middle of the floor, they very abruptly came to a stop and pulled back behind the corridor. The president was just around the corner, along with more of his top employees, which was why they were forced to stop before they could be seen. They peered around the corner and watched as President Shinra and the rest of his employees walked into the large conference hall in the middle of the room, shutting the door firmly behind them. Cloud and his group stepped out into the corridor again, and stopped just outside the conference hall.
Now what?
Barrett asked.
We need to hear what's going on in there, said Cloud. Maybe we can find out where Eris is.
He looked at the locked door.
But how to get in there?
The three fell silent as they thought for a moment on a way to eavesdrop into the meeting that was going on in the room beyond. Tifa suddenly clicked her fingers.
I know,
she exclaimed, and before Cloud or Barrett could ask her what it was, she turned and ran off away from them. They followed her as she ran around the corner and stopped at the end of the corner, just outside the floor toilets. She signaled for Cloud and Barrett to follow her before she ran inside the toilets and out of sight. Cloud and Barrett looked at each other blankly, and then followed her into the toilets. Tifa was standing in one of the cubicles at the end of the toilets, stood up on one of the toilets and fiddling with the latch of an overhanging grate that led into the air ducts that ran between each floor. Finally the latch came undone and Tifa pushed the grate up into the duct, and then she grabbed onto the sides and pushed herself up into the duct. Finally Cloud and Barrett realized what Tifa was up to. The ducts ran between each floor, and there would be more grates opening out into other parts of the floor to ventilate them, including the conference room. Which meant that if they followed the ducts correctly, they would be able to see and hear directly into the conference room without being seen themselves. So they followed Tifa up into the duct. It was a very compact space, and Barrett could only just fit with his large form. Tifa and Cloud fitted in quite easily, and began to navigate their way through the small maze of ducts towards the conference room. They soon found it and came to a stop around it, peering down into the conference room, where the meeting was about to begin.
Geez!
Exclaimed Barrett.
That's a lot of suits.
End of chapter. Episode 20, Part 01, Chapter 20. Chapter 20. Cloud and the two surviving Avalanche members gazed down into the conference hall below, as the meeting was about to begin. President Shinra was sat in his own chair at the head of the table, a formal look on his face as they prepared to begin their discussion. All around him were some of his top executives, and Barrett was right, there were a lot of suits. Heidegger was one of the executives at the table, a very smug look on his hairy face. Clearly, he was still pleased over their triumph in Sector 7, and most likely he still believed that they had wiped out Avalanche along with the rest of the people in Sector 7. Saturday beside him was Palmer, a rather plump man with a jolly red face that seemed to stand out amongst the serious faces of the other executives around him. He was also a Shinra executive, but unfortunately his department in the company was one that was ignored most times. Opposite Palmer was a woman known as Scarlet, dressed in a long silk red dress with one long slit spreading all the way up to her thigh to reveal most of her leg, and had blonde hair that was tied up behind her. Her face was caked in makeup to mask her cold-hearted expression, although it didn't work for she just looked as cold as ever. And lastly there was Reeve sat opposite Heidegger. He still looked uncomfortable and concerned over the recent events that had occurred, but as usual no one took any notice of his fears. Reeve began the meeting.
We have the damage estimates for Sector 7, he said to the president. Considering those factories we already set up and all the investments, the damage is estimated at approximately 10 billion gil. The estimated cost to rebuild Sector 7 is... We're not rebuilding, President Shinra interrupted blankly.
Reeve blinked.
What?
President Shinra picked up a glass of water from the table and sipped it. He closed his eyes as he spoke.
We're leaving Sector 7 as it is, he said. And restarting the Neo-Midgar plan. Then the Ancients. The promised land will soon be ours,
the president assured him, putting his glass back down on the table. He looked at Reeve.
I want you to raise the Mako rates 15% in every area. Rate hike. Rate hike. Tra, la, la.
Palmer sang loudly, jumping up and down in his chair excitedly like a little kid. He looked at the president with a childish, pleading expression.
And please include our space program in the budget.
President Shinra closed his eyes again and smiled.
Reeve and Scarlet will divide the extra income from the rate increase.
All at once Palmer stopped jumping up and down and froze on his chair, his hopes suddenly dashed. He knew what that meant, his department would get no money from the income at all. If it was just Reeve in charge of dividing the income there was a chance, but the moment the president mentioned Scarlet's name that ended it all. Scarlet was a cold-hearted witch concerned only with lining her own pocket and pouring money into her own department, which meant that Palmer and his space program would get absolutely nothing.
Oh man!
He wailed. He dropped his head pitifully down onto the desk and shook it as his dreams were crushed once again.
Sir,
Reeve said suddenly.
If you raise the rates, the people will lose confidence. It'll be all right,
President Shinra assured him knowingly.
The ignorant citizens won't lose confidence, they'll trust Shinra, Inc. even more.
Heidegger laughed loudly, his coarse voice like a grater as he laughed.
Ha, ha, ha. After all, we're the ones who saved Sector 7 from Avalanche.
He taunted, and laughed again. Up in the air duct above, Barrett fumed angrily.
That dirty ass!
He cursed furiously. He looked just about ready to burst into the meeting and kill everyone in that conference room. Luckily, he maintained just enough of his composure to restrain himself, and continued to look down into the meeting. Even so, his fist was shaking uncontrollably. It was at that moment that the door to the conference hall opened as a man walked in, and Cloud and his two friends leaned down as far as they could to see who it was. He walked up to the end of the conference table and stopped. He was obviously some kind of scientist, for he was wearing a long white lab coat that ran all the way down to his black shoes and almost dragged along the floor. His face was incredibly pale as though it had never seen any sunlight at all, he was probably cooped up in his laboratory all day. His hair was black and long, brushed slickly back into a ponytail that ran down to his shoulders, and a set of large glasses covered his small eyes. He had a very emotionless and blank expression, but through the glasses there was a cold, callous expression in his eyes. As he entered, walking with his arms clasped behind his back, everyone on the conference hall looked at him expectantly.
Hojo,
said the president.
How's the girl?
Hojo only glanced at the president.
As a specimen, she is inferior to her mother, he reported.
He looked down again thoughtfully.
I'm still in the process of comparing her to her mother, Eifelna, but for now the difference is 18%. How long will the research take?
Hojo stood upright and folded his arms in thought.
Probably 120 years,
he answered finally after considering all the factors and procedures needed for his research.
It's probably impossible to finish in our lifetime. Or in the lifetime of the specimen too, for that matter.
He turned back to the president and his executives.
That's why we're thinking of breeding her. Then we could create one that could withstand our research for a long time. What about the promised land?
President Shinra asked.
Won't it hinder our plans? That's what I need to plan,
said Hojo. He turned away.
The mother is strong. And yet has her weaknesses.
He covered his mouth with one hand as he chuckled darkly to himself, many plans hatching in his little mind. President Shinra nodded.
That concludes our meeting,
he said. With that the president got up out of his chair and headed calmly towards the door, leaving the meeting room and his executives behind. Once he was out of the room, the other executives stood up and began to leave the room one by one in silence. Scarlet stopped suddenly while the others walked past her. She looked around and sniffed the air, before turning to the grate in the ceiling above her. Her lip curled in disgust, and the cold expression was clear on her face as if an arrow had pierced a calm and tranquil pool of water.
Something stinks,
she muttered, her voice just as cold and unfeeling. Then she left the room, walking firmly on her high-heeled shoes. When she left, she shut the door of the room behind her, and only then could Cloud and his group relax and breathe freely once again.
They were talking about Eris.
Right? Cloud asked. Barrett shrugged.
I dunno.
Probably, said Tifa. Cloud looked back down into the empty briefing room.
Let's follow him,
he said. He began to clamber back through the air vents towards the grate where they had first climbed up, and dropped quietly back down into the empty toilets. Barrett and Tifa followed him, and they walked out casually out of the toilets, as though they belonged, and headed back round to the front of the meeting room. Before they stepped out into the corridor leading towards the stairs, Cloud and his group quickly came to a stop as they saw a familiar figure standing in the corridor, also heading towards the stairs. It was Hojo, the scientist from the meeting. He was walking casually towards the stairs, his arms hanging loosely behind his back, lost in thought as he walked.
Hojo? Hey.
Cloud whispered. He leaned in close to the wall of the meeting room and looked more closely at Hojo now that he was a little closer. He was fairly certain that Hojo had been talking about Eris when he talked of her as a specimen and when the president referred to the girl. He remembered Elmira saying that Eris once said she and her mother, her real mother, escaped from some kind of science laboratory. He was therefore quite sure that Hojo had been the scientist in charge at the time, and would certainly know where Eris was. He nodded to Barrett and Tifa behind him, and the three of them slid out quietly into the corridor, trying to avoid being seen by Hojo, as well as avoid looking suspicious by the people walking around them. They entered the stairway in time to see Hojo walking up the stairs away from them towards the next level, since someone of his importance would surely have access to the higher levels. Sure enough, as Hojo entered the next floor, he pulled the next keycard out of his pocket and swiped it through the slot. The red light turned blue and the door opened, allowing Hojo through. Yet Hojo neglected to swipe the card to lock the door again, and simply left it wide open as he carried on. Which was just perfect for Cloud and his team as they followed him up onto the next level, and stopped just at the top of the stairs. This was the last set of stairs leading up, for everything else was super restricted.
I remember him,
Barrett said suddenly. He crossed his arms and tapped his foot against the floor.
That Hojo guy. He's in charge of Shinra's science department. Cloud, don't you know him?
Cloud also crossed his arms thoughtfully, and shook his head.
This is the first time I've ever actually seen him,
he admitted. He looked up at the ceiling.
So. That's what he looks like.
They left the stairway and walked on to level 67 of the Shinra building. It was clear from the off that this was Shinra's most technical level. There were many closed-off offices, but from within them came the sounds of computers and people talking, hard at work even through the night. This was the home of Shinra's science department, where Hojo worked. Hojo was actually just a little way ahead of them, walking around to a small clearing filled with crates and tubes where he kept his prized specimens. As Hojo entered the clearing, he walked straight up to one large glass cylinder that rose all the way to the ceiling like a lift, and peered inside of it. Cloud's group were only a few feet behind, but instead of charging in and demanding information from Hojo, they decided to wait and see what was happening. There was a large pile of crates in the corner of the clearing next to a large dome-shaped holding cell, and the group hid behind that to observe. They were just in time too, for just as they hid, one of Hojo's assistants walked in and up to Hojo.
Is this today's specimen?
He asked. Hojo didn't even turn around.
Yes,
he replied.
We're starting right away. Raise it to the upper level.
His assistant nodded, before he turned and left to wherever the upper level was. Once he was gone, Hojo turned back to the glass shaft and peered again inside. His eyes seemed to light up for the first time as he looked inside at the creature that was held securely in there, seemingly very excited by his own genius. He reached out and gently tapped the side of the cell to get a reaction, but got nothing in return.
My precious specimen,
he whispered, very fondly. He then stood firmly upright, and began to saunter out of the clearing. Once he was gone, Cloud's team stepped out from behind their hiding place. Tifa walked right up to the glass shaft and peered at what was inside. It was a very strange creature that seemed to resemble a red wolf or a very large dog. It had a strong, sturdy body with a firm coat of fiery red fur that was covered in scars, presumably from battle. Its face was rectangular, but it had a mouth full of ferociously sharp teeth that looked incredibly strong. It had a small mane of sorts around its head, but it wasn't very large. There was also a long scar covering one of its eyes, and it was blinded there, although it seemed to be quite aware all the same. It also had a long tail that was swaying gently behind it, with a furry tip that emitted a fiery glow. What was most peculiar about this creature was the tattoo it had on its left shoulder. A tattoo saying 13, 13. It looked at Tifa through its one good eye as she leaned in and tapped the glass gently.
Precious specimen,
the girl whispered softly as she looked at the creature sitting dolefully inside. She looked up.
Is it going to be used for a biological experiment?
Neither Cloud nor Barrett answered her, simply because the answer was obvious. Tifa's face cringed up painfully as she turned back to the creature, wishing with all her heart that there was some way she could save the poor creature from its fate. While there was silence, Cloud slowly turned his head and glanced over at the peculiar dome beside them. It was made of an extremely thick metal, and the door was just as thick, with a single thick glass panel to enable others to see inside. There was a strange purple glow coming from within the dome. Cloud stared for a moment, and noticed a metal nameplate on the head of the door.
Genova,
he read. Curiously, he walked over to the door and grabbed onto the rim of the window, pulling himself up to look inside. The sight he was greeted with sent terrible cold and shocking chills down his spine, chilling his blood until it was like ice running through his veins. The creature contained inside was a misshapen mess, with a long body of flesh that seemed to thicken the lower down it got, and hideous lumps around its collarbones, if it had bones, that almost looked like eyes glaring back at him. There was nothing past its neck, its head had been cleanly removed. What was most terrifying of all was that it was pulsing slightly and moving a little, still alive, even without its head. The shock of the sight made Cloud lose his grip on the window, where he dropped back down onto his feet. He stepped back, but already his knees were turning to jelly as he lost the feeling in the lower half of his body. A loud ring resonated loudly in his ears and he held his head tightly, unaware that his body was shaking uncontrollably. It was only as he fell to his knees and collapsed onto the floor that Tifa and Barrett noticed, and Tifa ran to him quickly. Cloud tried to stand up as she approached, but his knees were still weak and he simply fell back into Tifa's arms.
Genova? Sephiroth's?
Cloud gasped, his voice faint and trembling.
So? They've brought it here. Cloud, be strong.
Tifa urged him. She wrapped her arms tightly around Cloud's shoulders, pressing his head against her chest. He was shaking badly, but was still strong enough to speak.
Did you see it?
He asked.
See what?
Asked Barrett.
It's moving. Still alive.
Barrett turned to the dome and looked at the door. He then walked over and peered silently into the dome. His eyes opened wide and he jumped back fiercely, just as shocked by the creature.
Where's its fucking head?
He shouted angrily, waving his arms around. He stopped jumping and waved to Cloud and Tifa.
This whole thing's stupid. Let's keep going.
The group turned and left the dome containing the hideous headless creature, and deeper into the clearing. They were sure that they were close to Eris, they could almost feel her light-hearted, happy presence beside them. Hojo had talked about moving the wolf-like creature to the upper level, which the group presumed to be the next floor up, level 68 of the Shinra building. The only way up to the higher floors now was through the lift and the keycards, and they had no doubt that Hojo was the only one on this floor with such access, so there was no use them trying to get a keycard from anyone else on this level. However, this part of the level was a storage space, so they figured that there must be some way of moving the crates and specimen cages up without using the lift. Sure enough, there was a way just a little further into the clearing. There was an old-style lift in the far corner, which was just a metal platform within a grated cage, with a pulley to pull the lift up towards the higher levels. The group immediately piled onto it. Once they were all safely inside, Tifa pulled the old rusty gates shut, and Barrett and Cloud began to pull on the pulley. There was a loud grating sound as the lift began to move jerkily upwards, little by little, towards the floor above. As they finally reached the top, Barrett secured the pulley in the hinges to stop it from dropping down back to the floor below. Tifa then forced the old, rusty gates open, letting in a bright wave of light from the floor they were on. One by one they piled out, and stared at the sights that awaited them. Cloud opened his eyes wide.
Eris.
End of chapter.